Well, welcome everyone. It's nice to see you in the audience, and it's great to have you here with us. This is one of a series of events that the Medieval Institute is putting on this year to celebrate our 75th anniversary on this campus. We're the oldest institute, interdisciplinary institute at the University of Notre Dame, and one of the oldest medieval studies centers or institutes or programs in the United States. And some of our events have been kind of entertaining, like having a blacksmith a couple of weeks ago before the game started, show how he makes replica medieval swords and knives. Others have been, I think, entertaining but more serious as well, like a roundtable we sponsored a month or so ago on post-pandemic labor markets, pandemics causing labor market problems both in the Middle Ages and in the modern period, as you well know. This is one of those second kind of events, and I'm grateful, I should say before I go on, for the co-sponsorship of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, and to Mahan Mirza, who just walked in, who is their director, for co-sponsoring this event with us. This event, in many ways, celebrates the great breadth of scholarly interest that the Medieval Institute represents. We began as an institute to study the 12th century forebears of the thought of Thomas Aquinas back in 1946, and have grown to include not only that, but a whole vast range of things, including a great deal to do with medieval Judaism and a great deal to do with medieval Islam. We have extremely fine scholars of medieval Arabic, medieval Islamic thought, medieval Islamic theology, medieval Islamic philosophy here, as well as scholars of late antique and medieval Judaism, including a wonderful young scholar of Spanish Kabbalah who's just joined us a few years ago. But it also addresses a crucial concern of our day, as you will see in a moment when I introduce the moderator. The moderator for today's event is, in fact, my colleague Therese Cory, who's a member of the philosophy department here at the University of Notre Dame. She's the John and Jean Oesterle Associate Professor of Thomistic Studies, and is interested in such issues as the medieval theories of personhood and mind, as well as being a very important proponent of and scholar of the influence of Avicenna and Averroes, Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd on the thought of Thomas Aquinas in particular, who was in many ways a very Arab thinker because of those influences. So I'm going to turn it over now to Therese to get us into the discussion and introduce our panelists. Thank you, Therese.
So thank you to the Medieval Institute for organizing this event. I'm very excited to be here and to be able to moderate. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the topic, and then I'm going to introduce each of our panelists for today. So what about the topic that confronts us today? And the question for us is, what will promote our common good? This question has been debated through the COVID-19 pandemic by public health officials, bioethicists, business managers, and economists, not to mention our lawmakers and elected representatives. Political philosopher Michael Sandel considers the common good to be what we owe each other as citizens, sharing the benefits and burdens of common life. Yet individuals within a given society will adhere to competing conceptions of what constitutes the common good and how to balance health risks with economic ones. Over the past 2 years, leaders around the world have endeavored to stop the spread of the virus while ensuring that people can pay bills, keep their housing, and put food on the table. Striving for the common good involves sorting through complex relations between individual behavior, public policies, and social institutions. Often we've seen that personal rights appear to be threatened by or in competition with public safety measures designed to promote communal flourishing. If health is a common good that we must act collectively to protect, what claims can your neighbor make on you? Alternatively, what sacrifices will you ask your neighbor to make on your behalf? Our roundtable discussion today will investigate the common good, what it is, and how we achieve it by taking a long historical view. When debate grows contentious, studying the subject from a distance can provide much needed perspective, and that's what the discipline of history offers us. Our panelists will speak to 3 of the major philosophical and religious traditions of the Middle Ages, an epoch that dealt with a pandemic of its own in the bubonic plague. They will consider how the concept of the common good developed in varieties of medieval thought and what implications those developments have for our current debates about personal freedom and public safety during the COVID-19 pandemic. So what we'll do is have each panelist speak for about 15 minutes about the common good in one medieval tradition and how that connects to the panelists' experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll then allow 15 minutes for the panelists to respond to what they heard from each other, and then we'll take questions from the audience for the last half hour. You'll find index cards and pens in your seats, and we'll ask you to write your questions on the index card and collect them. We'll collect them when it's time for questions, and then I'll read the questions aloud over the microphone for the panelists to answer. Now it is my pleasant task to introduce our panelists. And we'll proceed in alphabetical order here. But Michael Friedland has served as rabbi of Sinai Synagogue in South Bend for 25 years. He was ordained in 1990 from the Jewish Theological Seminary and has worked in smaller Jewish communities his entire career and mentored rabbinical students interested in working in small congregations. He received his Doctor of Divinity degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2020 and has recently finished his Doctor of Hebrew Letters degree from Spertus College of Judaica in Chicago. Daniel Horan, OFM, is the director of the Center for Spirituality and professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. He previously held the Duns Scotus Chair of Spirituality at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. A columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, he is the author of 13 books, including Catholicity and Emerging Personhood, a Contemporary Theological Anthropology, and his latest, titled A White Catholic's Guide to Racism and Privilege. His next book, due out in fall 2021, is The Way of the Franciscans, A Prayer Journey Through Lent. Third, we have Ebrahim Moosa, the Mirza Family Professor of Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies in Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs and Department of History. Born in South Africa, Moosa earned his MA and PhD degrees from the University of Cape Town. His interests span both classical and modern Islamic thought, with a special focus on Islamic law, history, ethics, and theology. He's authored 2 monographs, edited 4 books, and published numerous articles and policy papers. With Scott Appleby and Atalia Omer, Professor Moosa co-directs the Global Research and Educational Initiative Contending Modernities, which examines the interaction among Catholic, Muslim, and other religious and secular forces in the world. So please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you very much for the invite to speak to you today. I'm going to begin with a comment from a Catholic writer, and I'm going to mispronounce his name because it's a Dutch name, so I apologize. Roman Gieters or Gujeters, he has in his article, Solidarity, the Common Good and Social Justice in the Catholic Social Teaching Within the Framework of Globalization, states that the Catholic Church fosters a unitary vision of reality in which cultural and religious differences are not absolute. All practitioners of faith are seekers of the ultimate truth, proclaiming, teaching, and promoting the idea of this universal and knowable moral law that is written on the human heart is, according to the author, the pedagogical function of Catholic social teaching. Now, I don't presume to be a scholar of Jewish history or of medieval Jewish history, but as mentioned, I recently completed a dissertation on a medieval text written by an exile of the Spanish expulsion, Solomon ibn Verga. And Ibn Verga's writings lead to a similar conclusion from a Jewish framework, which is made all the more remarkable because it was written 500 years ago, and it's obviously coming out of a context of oppression. The text is called Shevet Yehudah, which we can translate as Scepter of Judah, and it purports to be a historiography detailing the history of catastrophes against the Jewish people, but a close, detailed reading of the text displays a growing sensitivity, what we might call the common good, or at least commonality in religious anthropology. Ibn Verga was born sometime in the mid-15th century in Spain, and he comes from a prominent family, very learned in Jewish studies. He's also well-versed in secular studies. A contemporary Spanish source refers to him as a rabbi, and that he was a communal representative for the Jews of Castile and Aragon. After the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, he and his family moved to next-door Portugal, like many Spanish Jews. However, in 1497, after welcoming the Jews in, King Manuel forcibly converted all the Jews to Catholicism. Now, we have to assume, therefore, that Ibn Verga and his family were converted at that time. But in 1506, King Manuel offered to allow those new Christians who wished to leave to go, and Ibn Verga and his family took the opportunity to move east. The destination was Turkey, but recently discovered text by a member of the Ibn Verga family wrote that Ibn Verga himself died in Flanders, Belgium, on the way. His only known work, Shevet Yehudah, was not published until almost 50 years after his death by his son Joseph in Turkey. Now, it's a fascinating work. It appears to be a work of Jewish history and could be counted among a relatively plentiful source of Jewish history writing that developed in the century after the expulsion. The book contains 64 chapters, and most detailed historical catastrophes, from blood libels, communal expulsions, to mass killings. But interspersed in these historical vignettes are imagined dialogues between Spanish and Portuguese kings and their advisors on Jewish affairs with Jewish leaders. I keep using the language of purported history writing because it certainly isn't history as we understand it in the modern sense of an earnest attempt to discern what actually happened at a certain time. But I don't think Ibn Verga was even interested in writing history with the goal of teaching moral or political lessons. I think the book was intended by Ibn Verga as a social critique of Jewish mores, with the message that Jews themselves were guilty at some level for causing their own demise, and offering a program, therefore, to lessen that danger in the future. In doing so, he demonstrates the dangers of religious chauvinism for both Jews and Christians, and by doing that, he points us in the direction of the idea of the common good. Now, Jose Faur, a scholar of rabbinics and Jewish history, went so far as to state that Jewish modernity was inaugurated by the Shevet Yehudah. Now, what motivated him to make this statement? Well, first, throughout the work, Shevet Yehudah references Gentile scholars and wisdom literature, such as the classics, Plato and Aristotle, Hieronymus, but also more contemporary, or not exact, but medieval Christian thinkers, writers like Nicholas de Lyra. He's learned in these texts, and he's very respectful of them. At one point, he praises the value of studying history, which Jews didn't really do in the middle. We don't really have that much. That's why the 16th century was so unique. There really wasn't much history writing by Jews in the medieval period. Mostly it was Jewish law or mysticism, one of those disciplines. So he admires the value of studying history, and he says this is common among the Gentile elite who learn valuable lessons from history. Also, just as forceful as he is in pointing out the foolishness of the blood libel in the voice of this imaginary King Alfonso and his advisor Thomas, for example, in one long conversation between the two, the king is just exasperated when peasants keep bringing him news about Jews killing Christians for their blood. And he shouts out, "Even though the libel is completely irrational, how shall I respond to these fools?" Ibn Verga, though, is also vigilant in denying anti-Christian assertions. Thomas, the advisor, points out that the idea of the Trinity being one is not that different from what he learned from studying with Jewish Kabbalists, clearly referring to the idea of the Sfirot as manifestations of the Godhead, the mystical notion of the God's manifestation being broken up into 10 levels and personifying those levels in this the Sefirot literature. He's clearly pointing out, look, we Jews did the same thing, so relax. He points out also that God who removed Christians. This is Thomas again. Again, this is Thomas Ibn Verga speaking through Thomas, right? Because this is the book is written in Hebrew for a Hebrew reading audience. Thomas tells the king, Christians are mocked by saying that because we bow before the form of man, even if it is the noblest of forms. But the God who removed the Jews from all shapes commanded the cherubim be made in the temple in the form of man. So again, the idea we Jews do it too, relax. He offers a sociological and anthropological explanation for religiosity. Thomas, again, the Christian advisor, attempts to explain the reason for Jewish aversion to pork. It is not because he doesn't say anything about the fact that it's commanded in the Torah, but rather he says, fat and blood strengthen desire, as pork and other animals do. But the Jew pursues fornication, therefore must be cautioned and prevented from elements that assist in increasing desire. Now we can read that, first of all, it can be tongue-in-cheek. It can also be read as a criticism that Ibn Verga, the Jewish community, is hearing from Catholics. But throughout the work, he is very critical about Jewish misbehavior, sexual misbehavior. And so it seems to me that he's pointing out to fellow Jews, look, you know what, you got to be careful with how you behave. As opposed to the truth of revelation that comes through empirical experience, as the medieval philosopher Judah Halevi wrote several hundred years before Ibn Verga, King Alfonso, speaking for Ibn Verga again, responds to Thomas's sociological explanations by stating, everyone agrees that religions only exist by the virtue of imagination. The Jew imagines that there is no other religion and no faith but his own, and he who believed in something else is in his eyes like an animal. And the Christian imagines that the Jew is but a human-shaped animal whose soul dwells in the lowest compartment of hell. And should you ask a Muslim, he would say both of us, that hell is crowded with us. Each religious community was limited by what they were taught and by the dogmas of their faith. So the Jew assumes that his religion and faith tradition is the only one that makes sense, and Christians and Muslims are the same. The historian Amnon Raz Krakotskin understands this conversation to exhibit the theological dimension of a transition toward modern historical consciousness. Now, a common self-criticism throughout Shevet Yehuda is that Jewish arrogance encouraged Christian anti-Semitism. In another imagined conversation, this time between King Pedro and his advisor Nicholas, Nicholas accuses the arrogant Jews of claiming that Christianity is a false religion. Now, the king doesn't trust Nicholas's biases, and so he calls in a Jew, and he puts the question to him, which religion is the best? The first answer from the Jew is, my religion is best for me. I was brought out of Egypt via signs and wonders, and it's worthwhile for me to remain a Jew because of that. But for you, your religion is best. Your continued rule shows that. Basically, you Christians are in power, it's working for you. The king is not satisfied, and he wants to know what the Jew thinks. Tell me which religion is better. So the Jew returns the next day, and he offers a parable. A friend left him 2 precious stones for his 2 children. The 2 children came to the Jew and wanted to know which gem is better and what the difference in value is. And the Jew says that, look, only your father can answer that. Don't ask me. And then he comes to the king. He says, they're very upset with me, and they're threatening me. King isn't happy to hear this, and he says, I'm going to punish them. And the Jew responds, don't you understand? I'm offering a parable about Judaism and Christianity. Only God can make this distinction. King's very impressed. Now, Nicholas, the advisor, pushes back on this idea of equity between faiths, and he even brings in a letter from the Roman, which he says is from the Roman historian Josephus, who lived at the time of the Roman occupation, and turned against the Jews, his people, and became this Roman historian. Now, this letter is made up by Ibn Verga. Josephus is real, but Ibn Verga makes up the letter. And he points out in the letter that internecine fighting and bad behavior of the Jews during the war against Rome, that caused their demise. The king in Ibn Verga's fantasy is not persuaded to convert the Jews to Christianity, as Nicholas wants, And he says, would that our time suffice to perfect our own souls, rather than we should expend it to perfect the souls of the Jews. There's a sense here that we really got to work on ourselves. That's what the focus is, not on others. Now, Ibn Verga may have been ahead of his time, but he also may have been a part of it. In a study of inquisitorial records from Soria, Jonathan Edwards found a trend among Jewish and Gentiles brought before the inquisitorial court in the 15th century of Spain, what he calls religious doubt and religious universalism. Some conversos admitted they saw no difference between their old religion and the new one. Quote, I tell you, said one of the conversos, that's what they say in Mass is the Psalms, what the Jews used to say in prayer. And the epistle is what was in the prophecies, which the Jews used to read. And the gospel was from Genesis, and it's all from the old law. End quote. Not all called before the Inquisition were Jews. There was a peasant who was interrogated, and because he questioned the miracle that Jesus actually provided bread for 5,000 people. Now, another strand of opinion found in these statements might be termed religious universalism. 8 men and a woman expressed the view that Christianity was not, as the church taught, the sole means of salvation. A parish priest, while denying the accusation that he had said that he did not know which of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam was the best religion, nevertheless repeated his view that adherents of each of these faiths might achieve salvation according to their own law. In another source, in response to anxiety over a drought, a farmer was accused of stating, how do you expect it to rain when the king is going to take the Muslims home away, when they haven't done anything to him? His friend protested, in accordance with official propaganda, that the Catholic faith was being spread by the campaign. But the first farmer responded, how does anyone know which of the 3 laws God loves best? And there's no indication that this farmer was Jewish. So while inquisitorial records, of course, have to be read with a grain of salt, we don't know how they gathered the incriminating material, scholars of this period, from the 20th century, Yitzhak Ber and Eliezer Goodworth, more recently have shown that there was a lot of cultural borrowing during this period. There's even a suggestion by Goodworth that the Shevet Yehuda was based not on Renaissance, Italian Renaissance fiction, which is what Ber could believe, but rather actually Spanish writing of the period. This was also the age of Christian Hebraism as well. Some Christians were drawn to the study of Hebraic sources, and they had to seek out learned Jews to study with. So my point really here about the common good is that Jews and Christians, and I'm sure this is true for Jewish interactions with Muslim cultures as well, the idea that humans have the same share in human nature grows organically through these interactions, these connections. Ibn Verga was not the only Jewish scholar in the medieval and early modern period who believed this. Menachem HaMeiri, who's a 13th century French rabbi, issued a legal ruling intended to alter the status of non-Jews in Jewish law permanently. He ruled that all discriminatory legislation in the Talmud, and there is some regarding interaction with Jews and Christians in courts, Jewish courts and Christian courts, but he ruled that all the discriminatory legislation in the Talmud applied only to ancient pagans and idolaters who rejected the moral teaching of the Bible and the belief in one God. Jews are to act with, in his words, nations restricted by the ways of religion, that's his understanding, that's his term for monotheism, in the same ways they are commanded to act toward fellow Jews. On the other side, the first written history of the Jews was written by a French Huguenot, Jacques Basnage de Baval. While he believed that the Jews should convert to Christianity, he was opposed to forced conversion. And his book raised the idea of the return of Jews to history in a new ecumenical context that includes both Jews and Christians. By the 19th century, we have scholars such as Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Berlin from Belarus and Lithuania, who interprets God's anger at the inhabitants of the Tower of Babel because of their uniformity. That is, the idea of diversity as a societal good was taking root. It's good to have lots of different groups. And of course, in the 20th century, we have Jewish educators such as Alexander Dushkin, who took this term that you hear all the time now, tikkun olam, which literally means repair of the world. Its origin, it has nothing to do with the way it's explained today. It was a mystical concept, an internal mystical concept. But the idea of tikkun olam, repairing the world, Dushkin and later, it's ubiquitous today, and others took it to invoked it to make the case for the congruence of Jewish and democratic values. So it's this notion of connections with each other, interactions, cultural borrowings, I think, that eventually lead to this growing sense that all human beings really are the same. I mean, there's certainly a theological underpinning to it from Genesis, but once people are meeting with each other, even in situations like Ibn Vergo, which was not a situation where everybody lived equally, there's this recognition that human beings are the same. And because of that, to grow this recognition of the common good.
Well, let me add my thanks as well to the Medieval Institute, and congratulations on 75 years, and express my gratitude for being a part of this panel. Questions about how to balance individual desire and freedom with interest, rights, and security of the broader community have been the source of great debate and at times even revolution over the course of the ages. The history of political philosophy and theological ethics bears witness to the perennial nature of this tension and the manifold approaches proposed in theory and engaged in practice in each era that we can recount. Now, given that I am neither a political theorist nor a theological ethicist, I will avoid making any prescriptive or normative claims this afternoon and instead focus very narrowly on the subject at hand, namely conceptions of the common good in medieval thought and their potential ressourcement for our own time, especially in light of the ongoing debates about how to respond properly to the threats arising from a global pandemic. To this end, I'm going to offer some reflections on what an underappreciated and infrequently resourced medieval Franciscan philosopher and theologian might provide us in thinking about the theme of the common good in the age of the coronavirus pandemic. I would like to make a case for greater engagement with the thought of Blessed John Duns Scotus, whose distinctive contributions to scholastic theology and philosophy are far too numerous for me to list here, let alone consider adequately in the time we have together, though I am tempted to keep you all hostage. Anticipating that our audience this afternoon may represent a range of familiarity with medieval thought generally, and with Christianity in particular, and Scotus, better known as the subtle doctor in some circles especially, I'm going to try to avoid getting overly technical and seek, perhaps in the spirit of the common good of our gathering this afternoon, simply to highlight a few areas that I believe are worthy of further consideration, correlation, and application in our time. But first, who was John Duns Scotus? Some of you may be thinking that right now. And by SCOTUS, spelled the same way, I do not mean the Supreme Court of the United States. This SCOTUS, despite the fact that he is unpopular in some historical circles, is still quite more popular than probably the Supreme Court of this land. With all due respect to the former law professor here at this institution. Scotus, the one that I'm talking about, was born around the year 1265 in the village of Duns, Scotland. He joined the Franciscan friars in England at a relatively young age and was ordained to the priesthood in 1291. And that date might seem arbitrary or weird to mention, but it's the first verified date we have about Scotus's life, given the accuracy of sacramental records in the late 13th century. Truthfully, we don't really know when he was born or when he joined the friars. He was educated at the nascent universities of Oxford and Paris, lecturing at both locations at various points in the early years of the 14th century. Shortly after being named a regent master in Paris in 1305, he was sent by the Franciscan order to Cologne, Germany, where he was tasked with running the studium, or the house of studies there, for the friars in ministerial formation. He died there shortly thereafter on November 8, 1308. We do know that date. So please, on Monday, as we commemorate his feast day, keep him in mind and perhaps, if you're inclined, say a little prayer. He is, in the Roman Catholic tradition, beatified, which means he's just one step away from that big S saint. So, even though he died at the tragic age of 42, he was a prolific writer and a scholar of the highest order, whose originality and creativity was frankly unparalleled in his time. His contributions are notable in several areas worth mentioning by way of example. His metaphysical reflection and famous argument for a univocal concept of being as the condition of the possibility for analogia entis, for any kind of discussion analogically. His distinctive argument for a positive principle of individuation, commonly referred to today by the Latin expression hac ceitas. His famous theological defense of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which was incorporated into Pope Pius IX's declaration of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception in 1854. With all due respect to Therese and the angelic doctor, he argued against the Dominicans in favor of the Immaculate Conception, and it took a couple hundred years, but, well, one thing is dogmatic and another thing is not. His theological arguments as well from the absolute present order for a supralapsarian understanding of the divine reasoning for the incarnation of the eternal Word. Put simply, God would have become human even if Adam and Eve, that is us, had not sinned. As well as his contributions to philosophical ethics and moral theology, particularly as it relates to medieval conceptions of natural law, and these are just a few of the things that he has contributed to. Despite the fact that Scotus is not the household name today that Thomas Aquinas, or even to a lesser extent Bonaventure or Bondaratio is, thanks in some part to Leo XIII's 1879 encyclical Aeternis Patris, which elevated St. Thomas to the status of the so-called common doctor of the Catholic Church, Scotus has nevertheless influenced centuries of philosophers, theologians, and even poets. From Karl Rahner and Wolfhart Pannenberg in the 20th century to Charles Sanders Peirce, Martin Heidegger, Gilles Deleuze, to Gerard Manley Hopkins, Teilhard de Chardin, and Thomas Merton, to include a surprising amount of influential contemporary voices. There are more I can name, but so many folks who we recognize as being eminent and significant contributors to thought in their own right have Scotus somewhere in the shadow. Like these thinkers and many others, I believe that Scotus continues to be an important resource, including for many of the issues we face in our own time. Which brings me to the common good. When it comes to the concept of the common good, we have to acknowledge that it is very much an anachronism to look for medieval Christian expressions that align with what our modern Catholic social teaching understands the term to mean. As Dennis McCann has noted, what Catholic social teaching means is not necessarily identical with the meanings represented in this term by medieval theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas or his later disciples in the history of scholasticism and neo-scholasticism. Notre Dame's own ethics professor, Jean Porter, makes a similar observation in her own careful study of the notion of the common good in the thought of Thomas Aquinas himself. This difference is not limited to Thomas, but generally applies to all scholastic thinkers who, in the spirit of now St. John Henry Newman, would perhaps recognize threads of continuity in their own thought and contemporary church teaching on the common good, might they, in an alternative context, have had the chance to see what would develop and blossom in the centuries that followed their deaths. So I don't want to say there's a disconnect, but we have to be honest about how the terms are understood in the respective times. I say this not to throw a wet blanket on the subject of our panel discussion. That would be the end of my contribution. But instead to contextualize what it is we are talking about when we talk about the common good in the thought of someone like Scotus. Simply put, he did not have an understanding of the concept as clearly articulated in conciliar teaching like that of Gaudium et Spes at Vatican II, or in the ordinary magisterium of popes like John XXIII, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, or even Pope Francis. Nevertheless, I believe there are at least several ways Scotus's thought might help us respond to the challenges and tensions that exist today as we reflect on how to respect the individual agency and yet protect and promote the common good. So I want to highlight, in the time that I have, which is limited here, 4 areas of Scotus's thought that may be useful to us in our contemporary context. And these are the primacy of the will over the intellect, the universal dignity and value of all creation, which arises from his distinctive argument about the principle of individuation, his understanding of the levels of moral goodness, and the divinely intended harmony of goodness God wishes for creation. Reflecting on Scotus's place within the Augustinian Franciscan intellectual tradition, Sister Mary Beth Ingham writes, "Framed in beauty and love, a metaphysics of goodness grounds Franciscan moral theory. In addition to the metaphysical assertion of the divine image, all Franciscan writers emphasize the superiority of loving over knowing as key to moral life. She adds, moral living realizes our metaphysical possibility. It is that process by which we imitate divine life and are thereby divinized. This makes the Franciscan moral tradition a praxis-based tradition, which integrates reflection into action. Simply put, as Ingham has said elsewhere, this means that for Franciscans, understanding God is not as excellent as loving God. By means of my will, I am able to love God with a love of friendship. By means of my will, I am able to love the good and to sacrifice my petty desires and needs in light of a greater good. To be clear, the Franciscan intellectual tradition also highly values the faculty of reason and the intellect. I want to be clear for all the Thomists in the room. It is just when speaking of order of precedence, the will receives primacy in Scotus's thought, and in this way he's not unlike his Parisian predecessor Bonaventure. Relatedly, Scotus's methodological approach departs from a stricter Aristotelian teleological view governed by the life of natural virtue shaped by the intellect that is taken up by, for example, Thomas Aquinas. It instead focuses on the exercise of human freedom in the actual present order, focusing instead on the pattern of divine love which humanity ought to strive to emulate in our own contexts. This subtle distinction is significant for our conversation today, I believe, because it situates moral reasoning and just action, that is, a case for the common good, and situates that in divine exemplarity. As the Gospel of John explains, it is loving one another as the Creator has first loved us and continues to sustain us in that same love that is our guiding hermeneutic. The second point, given Scotus's argument for a positive principle of individuation, today usually referred to as hachetas, though he used that only twice in his writings, which is absolutely unique, intrinsic, unrepeatable, inalienable, and identical with the thing's actual existence. His understanding of the inherent dignity and value of all creation serves as a foundational principle worthy of greater reflection. As it pertains to human beings, this means that everybody has a divinely granted dignity on account of their very existence. As the great late Scotus scholar and Franciscan friar Alan Walter noted on this point, Scotus makes an important claim that where rational beings are concerned, it is the person rather than the nature that God primarily desired to create. His remark is in answer to an objection, that is, his contribution responds to an objection that individuals do not pertain to the order of the universe, for order is based on priority and posteriority, and individuals are all on par with one another. That's again the Aristotelian framework that's presumed. Not only do individuals pertain to the order of God's universe, Scotus answers, but in communicating God's goodness as something befitting God's beauty in each species, God delights in producing a multiplicity of individuals. And Scotus goes on to say, and I quote, "And in those beings which are the highest and most important," he's thinking of us, humans, "it is the individual that is primarily intended by God." This admittedly technical insight opens up for us another way to look at the relationship between the individual and the communal, at least as it pertains to the human family. There is a sense in which Scotus's principle of individuation would seem to invest each person with unique value as one singularly wanted and loved by God, quite apart from any trait that person shares with others or any contribution he or she might make to society. The common good in this frame reflects the universal and inalienable dignity and value that all persons have by matter of their contingent existence, occasioned by nothing other than divine love. As such, there is as much a duty to attend to the conditions of human flourishing for anybody else as much as for oneself, apart from any deontological or duty-driven or golden rule sensibility, with all due respect to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. For Scotus, there's a metaphysical case, I believe, for promotion of the common good. In Book 2 of his Ordinatio, Scotus reflects on levels of goodness. This is the third point. While he will argue for 3 levels of goodness, moral goodness, he actually presumes a fundamental level of goodness which he calls natural goodness, which is sort of his version of the medieval axiom, omnis ens est bonum, or all that is or all that exists is good. Basically, God doesn't make garbage. You may have heard that expression from a parent or two or a teacher, right? Connected to his principle of hachetas, we begin to understand the ontological goodness of creation, especially humanity, in that given the subtle doctor's emphasis on the divine will and the contingency of creation, that we exist says something profound about God's loving intention to create in the first place when God could otherwise have not. But beyond the natural goodness of creation, Scotus offers a hierarchy of moral goodness reflected in praxis. The first level is rather basic. He writes, "The first of these characterizes a volition in virtue of the fact that it has an object that is suitable for that act according to a dictate of right reason, and not merely because it is naturally suitable for the act in the way that the sun is suitable for vision." Everybody follow? This is, in other words, doing something good beyond the mere requirement or any sense of necessity, right? The sun is necessary as good for our vision because it's required for us to see. It's necessary, as it were. The second level of moral goodness is characterized by that which is present in the first, it's something beyond necessity, and is elicited by the will, he says. So we choose it, we desire it. The third, highest level of moral goodness for Scotus is something that presupposes those first two, and is, as he says, an act in virtue of the fact that it is elicited in conformity with the principle of merit, which is charity or grace, or in other words, in accordance with the inclination of charity. In other words, it draws some response from God. God rewards or appreciates or recognizes the good work that we've done beyond something that is merely necessary, beyond something that we merely desire to do that is positive. To illustrate this, Scotus talks about almsgiving, which I think is a nice illustration that is shared in our respective traditions of praxis and prayer, of the three Abrahamic traditions represented here. Scotus writes, an example of the first level of goodness is giving alms, just purely. An example of the second is giving alms from one's own resources to a poor person who is in need and in the place in which it is most appropriate to give to him and on account of love for God. And an example of the third is doing this act not merely from natural inclination, as it could have been done in the state of innocence, but in that state of innocence remark is recognizing the kind of headwinds we face by virtue of the effects of original sin, right? So he's saying, in the age of innocence before the fall, it would have been a lot easier to just give alms, to do something good. But in our current absolute present order, charity plays a role by which the one who does such an act is a friend of God, insofar as God looks with favor on his or her act. The demarcation of goodness is significant for us, I believe, because it presumes an other-centeredness, divinely or grace-motivated exercise of the will. There is perhaps an argument to be made that one ought to receive the COVID-19 vaccine or comply with mask mandates because it is the logical thing to do, which might fall under that first level of goodness. Or one might even do it because they are compelled by concern for others, right? Volition of the will, a desire, the second level. But Scotus argues that such a good action exercised out of a free choice rooted in the love of the other, caritas, charity, love as he puts it, is the highest good and in turn pleases God, is meritorious in that regard. When we talk about the common good and look for how to account for agental freedom, right, my individual exercise of freedom or my will, Scotus appears to be offering us one way to think about this in a nuanced manner. Finally, the fourth point, moral goodness for Scotus arises from and is modeled after divine goodness and the love of the triune God. As we saw in Scotus's emphasis on the primacy of the will over the intellect, or love over knowledge, it is the pattern of divine love that serves as the guiding framework for right human action. One of the few places where Scotus invokes the literal phrase common good, although as stipulated, it's not in the same sense as contemporary magisterial teaching, is found in Book 3 of his Ordinatio, when he writes about authentic Christian love as that of, quote, love of friendship, which looks beyond the selfish interests toward the good of the other. Scotus continues and writes, I say that charity is called that practical habit by which God is held dear, since God, who is common good, does not wish to be anyone's personal good. Therefore, God, infusing the habit by which the soul moves orderly and perfectly toward him, gives the habit which is love, or caritas, by which he is held dear, God is held dear, as common good, and to be loved jointly by others, end quote. Okay, what is that mumbo jumbo? The divinely intended outcome of rightly ordered human loving and action is harmony and mutuality among the human family, which is modeled after the inherent communion that exists perfectly in the Trinity. That is, Deus ad intra, how God is within God's self. As Mary Beth Ingham explains, God is common good and does not wish to belong to any one person alone. It belongs to the divine nature to initiate a community of co-lovers. The perfection of justice and love flows beyond any one individual's friendship with God and moves toward a common, inclusive reality. The dynamic of charity grows and expands to create a community of all persons. Applied in the age of pandemic, and in the midst of the debates over how to respond, whether individual hesitancy, resistance, or antagonism ought to take precedence over the common good, Scotus's understanding of divine intention for humanity, conveyed through revelation and reason, makes clear that promotion and protection of what today we call the common good is the responsibility of all people, and that the resulting common good is itself a sign of finite participation in the divine life in the world today. So in conclusion, these brief reflections on SCOTUS's potential for informing our thinking about contemporary questions of the common good and engaging debates about rightly ordered loving in the age of pandemic does not do justice to the profundity of the subtle doctor's thought generally, or even in regard to the 4 points I raised here. But it is my hope that others, especially those interested, for instance, in political theory and theological ethics, as well as ordinary Christians and people of goodwill of any tradition, might take a new or renewed interest in this medieval Franciscan's thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Congratulations to the Medieval Institute for 75 years. Thank you, Therese, for for moderating the session, and thank you to my colleagues for your learned insights. So I'm going to also talk about a medieval figure that many of you might have heard about, or if you haven't heard about it, you're going to hear it for the first time today. His name is Al-Ghazali, and if you can't say the Al, just say Ghazali. Or just say Gaz. No, don't say that. Just say Ghazali, that's one way to say it, or Ghazali, to make it easier on you if you don't want to pull your Z's. Ghazali was a Persian scholar born in an area called Tus, which is near Mashhad today in Iran. And at a very young age, he lost his father and then went to a boarding school to learn knowledge of the tradition. And by the time he dies in 1111, it's very easy to remember when Ghazali died, 1111, he was born in 1058. In the middle of the 11th century, right in the first decade of, just over the first decade of the 12th century, he dies. And Ghazali is really a major figure in the Muslim tradition. He's the go-to person for everybody. He's the Scotus, he's the Ibn Verga, he's the Maimonides, he's the St. Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, all those figures within Islam. I'm exaggerating, but I'm trying to keep you awake at 10 to 4 in the afternoon. So, but Ghazali is an important figure, and you will be remiss that if you read any serious or half-serious book about Islam, Ghazali would be cited. And the reason for that is that the man just wrote a lot. But the man also had great, what we would call serious experiences in life. So after he completes his studies, and he's quite a, I would say aggressive scholar, because he writes a book in the lifetime of his teacher, and his teacher, Juwaini, is saying, could you not have waited until I died before you publish a book? In the medieval world, that was not often done. And this upstart was like showing off. And then Ghazali spends 10 years in the retinue of the prime minister of the Seljuks, who are the kind of major people, the ethnic group governing the Abbasid Empire. They were basically what we would call the muscle. They were the fighters, they were the army, and you had a titular caliphate at the top. And Ghazali served the prime minister served Ghazali, Ghazali served him in a variety of ways. And he was then given this major position in Baghdad at this very distinguished college, the Nizamiya college, that the wazir, the prime minister, whose name is Nizamul Mulk establishes this major institution of learning, and Ghazali becomes the major professor there. 2 years of great productivity and writes furiously. And after 2 years, he just goes in a deep depression. And he says, I could not get myself to speak or to write. This is a major mystery about what happened to Ghazali, what happened. Because he has this major position. He's feted when he comes into Baghdad. He's riding on horses with clothes and brocades of great value. And then Ghazali decides, I had enough of this. And he walks away. And he basically tells people around him that he's going for pilgrimage to Mecca. But he writes in his kind of a confession, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, This is the name of a book that he writes about his experiences, Deliverance from Error, and how he thinks God had delivered him from error. He said, I decided I'm going to go for pilgrimage, but I had no intention to come back. And part of the reason would be that people would consider him to be crazy. Who leaves a distinguished position at a major university and also college, and also the preservation and the advancement of knowledge is the highest service you can do in Islam. To disseminate knowledge is one of the highest services. And so Ghazali is doing something against the grain, but then this becomes a whole new phase in Ghazali's life when he leaves off. So this 4 years that he had in Baghdad is also mixed with some kind of politics. He's writing treatises in defense of the current government. And my own sense is that he becomes completely disgusted with himself. That he's putting his knowledge in service of politics and he's looking for something for his soul. And he then decides that he's going on this journey. He journeys from Baghdad to Damascus, from Damascus to Mecca, to Jerusalem, and he spends long amounts of time in those places, basically anonymously. He doesn't want people to know who he is because he already had established a reputation. And in this period, he writes a book called Ihya Ulumuddin. That's going to be part of the test, so you need to remember this title. The revivification or the revival of the sciences of religion. The revival of the sciences of religion. And this revival is basically the revival of Ghazali's soul. He's now saying that everything that is in the tradition must be for the service of the ethical and the moral. And he used the word, every chapter in that book, it's a 4-volume book, or even more, depends how big the type is, but nevertheless, he starts every chapter with the etiquette, the ethics of prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, friendship. How do you, and the book is organized, at least in terms of 2 major sections of that is, what are the things that are going to give you salvation, and what are those things that are going to be negative for your salvation. So this is Ghazali, and as I told you, Ghazali is an important figure because he's also seen as somebody who does a lot of the ethical work, a lot of the work in how to bring what we call Islamic mysticism into the conversation of what we call Sharia or law. But Ghazali himself is also a brilliant legal scholar, a jurist, what Jewish scholars would call studies of halakha, Sharia studies that we will call. And he's also a brilliant theologian. And also he had written extensively summarizing the views of the philosophers that preceded him, especially Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, and also criticized them for some views that are contrary to Muslim theological precepts, especially 3 things: that the philosophers believe that the world is eternal, that they believe that God knows only the universals, not the particulars. God only knows the big picture of things. God doesn't know the kind of fine print of things. And the 3rd thing is that that the philosophers believe that resurrection will be spiritual, not physical, not bodily. These 3 points, Ghazali said, he pulled out the red card and said, basically, this is wrong. And he leveled a fairly severe critic against that, against these philosophers, and then in some ways harmed his reputation, and I think he might have gone a little bit overboard in that. And there's been all kinds of historiographical disagreements, historical interpretations of, did Ghazali do damage to the Muslim philosophical and rational tradition, or is it something else? That's a separate question. So in one of his major works, almost one of his penultimate works, is called a book called The Quintessence, Al-Mustasfa. It's a book on legal and moral philosophy. And in other words, if you have Sharia law, that is the application of, and what are the rules, there's also a certain kind of philosophy, largely debates about language, debates about epistemology, what constitutes knowledge, and how do you interpret the sources? How do you interpret the Quran? How do you interpret the the statements and the actions of the Prophet Muhammad, and how do you make sense of that? So that is that book. In that book, Ghazali then touches a theme, a topic, that he says, this topic constitutes what we would call the kind of specious or dubious sources. And that dubious sources have got three themes and items under that heading, the dubious sources. But one of them is what he calls maslaha. Maslaha comes from the word salah, SLH root, which means the good, the fullness, that which is, complete. And also piety comes from that word. And maslaha means that which is in the best interest. What are the best interests? What is the public interest that we would call? And this is my foray, after explaining to you who Ghazali was, into this conversation about the common good. So Ghazali then makes the argument, and normally we would think about what is the good, in this way, he says we would think about it in to maximize the good and repel harm. That would be a common sense understanding, he says, of what is the good. Maximize the good and repel harm, or repelling the harm would then allow you to maximize the good. But he says that is not good enough. He says every human beings think about their big picture, their big purposes, their ends. What are they striving for? And it's those ends that you must have in mind. He calls it maqasid. And he says those ends of human beings must be congruent and in line with the ends that God wants for you and what the Sharia wants for you, those ends. And he then says, let me tell you what those ends are. And he identifies it as 5: to preserve religion, to preserve intellect, to preserve life, to preserve property, and to preserve family. 5 things that human beings strive for this too. For their religion, they strive for their life, to preserve life, rationality and intellect, family and property. That's how he summarizes that. And he says that, look, in my detailed study of Islamic teachings, I see this as other kind of big purposes. And obviously he connects this to the fundamental Islamic understanding that human beings are God's stewards on earth, that you have to live a life of responsibility, a responsible life, and the Sharia gives you that broad, framework of how you live within fulfilling that framework. Now, when he comes to think about this doctrine of maslaha, that is the kind of the nucleus of what we would call today the common good, because the common good, the public interest then would be adduced and decided in very different ways the way the public good is decided today, given the nature of society we have today. We have nation state, we have citizenship, those were empires. But nevertheless, Ghazali does make an argument that we can think about those interests can be one that are in harmony and consistent with the revelation or with the Sharia. Sharia is another word for revelation. Or it could be opposed to that, and then that would not be acceptable. Or the third one is that to which the Sharia is indifferent. It didn't say A or nay. So those are the 3 options you have. And he basically explains it, but he keeps on providing this rhetoric that you must remember that this is amongst the more dubious sources. Al-maslaha min al-usul al-mawhuma for the Arabs in this gathering. That maslaha is amongst the dubious sources. Nevertheless, Ghazali does his work and he plants that into the book. It doesn't form a major chapter, it's a subsidiary chapter. Now, some of these ideas, his teacher, Juwaini, the guy who was upset with him for writing a book in his lifetime, Juwaini had already given some of those ideas, but then these ideas are picked up in the in the 13th century by a man called Izzuddin ibn Abd Salam al-Sulami. That's another name for the text. But just remember him as Sulami. He's a Egyptian, and not Egyptian, but he lives in Egypt, and he's actually Syrian. First spent time in Syria, then in Egypt. He writes elaborately about how the public interest can be preserved. Now does more interpretive work, and Sulami also combines this interpretation with ideas of spirituality, what we call Islamic mysticism. And then obviously in the 14th century in Muslim Spain, in Andalus, there's a man called Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi. Shatibi dies in 1388. Shatibi writes a major treatise now, doing much more work than Ghazali did on trying to explain these purposes of the Sharia. In other words, these big picture, what I call the big picture version of the Sharia. Now, what we have in the course of Islamic history is that this debate that Ghazali started, other people picked up about this, what I would call the big picture version of the Sharia, or the Taj Mahal version of the Sharia. In other words, it's so beautiful, you can understand that these 5 purposes. It's very understandable. But it always and never was dominant until the 20th century. What was the dominant interpretation or form of interpretation is what I would call the micro-hermeneutics, the kind of very detailed interpretation of rules and regulations according to a roadmap that was very, very complex in understanding the revelation of the Quran, the prophetic statements, but also the interpretations over time of Muslim scholars in different parts of the world, where their own subcultures seep into the understanding of the interpretation of the law, and it's very, very complicated. You require quite a lot of skill to understand that. Fast forward the 20th century, Muslim reformers were trying to understand and the challenge that Islam faces, Islam as a faith tradition faces in the world, with the rise of European colonialism, and now the colonizers are leaving, but the colonizers have planted new seeds of modernity and modern education and the nation state in multiple Muslim countries. Muslim thinkers find themselves with their back against the wall because they were not the authors of these new things that are in their country, the new economies, the new medical systems, the new interpretations of the political and economic and so on, and that what they have is tradition. They have their religious tradition. And now there's a lot of controversy among Muslims of how do they use this tradition. There are those who are saying that some of these reformers are basically bowdlerizing tradition, corrupting tradition, taking what they like only to make Islam work. And others who are saying, no, we're going to stick to this detailed micro-hermeneutics with its full panoply of ideas and concept that must be implemented, that is more authentic. And the debate continues to this very day. But some of the people, a man by the name of Muhammad Abdu, who was an Egyptian, traveled to Tunisia, and he saw these Tunisians are reading this very interesting book that he never read and never knew about. And that is this book by this Andalusian, the man from Muslim Spain, Shatibi, that these Tunisian scholars are reading, and that is this wonderful book that talks about the purposes of the Sharia. Preservation of religion, preservation of life, preservation of intellect, property, and family, these big purposes. And they say, yes, this is the way that we can go forward. That is the reformers like Muhammad Abdu, his teacher Afghani, and also Rashid Rida, what we call the Arab reformers, the reform tradition. These are scholars who studied in orthodox institutions, but they're also tired with orthodoxy, who don't want to move forward and come onto a new page or to experiment with something new. So they caught between this, what I call this big picture version of the Sharia, and those people who followed what I call the telephone directory version of the Sharia. You remember all those kind of details and stuff. But as you know, a telephone directory quickly ages, right? You have to keep on changing it. So one of the things that the challenge that traditional Muslim scholars have is that how do they update the tradition? And the updating of tradition has been a soul-searing experience in modern Islamic life, because with which experience are you now going to update the tradition? The dominant tradition is a Western tradition, and Muslims feel left out and prevented from the historical tradition. And how do they now engage their tradition to make this conversation go? And so this doctrine of the public interest, the maslaha, what we would today call the common good, is very much in modern Islamic politics for those Islamic parties like the Muslim Brotherhood or the Jamaat Islami and others. When they think about the political or Muslim theologians, what we call theologians or Muslim clerics, they talk a great deal about this question of the public good and how to advance the public good. Now the question about the public good or the common good is that in the era of empire, wise kings and emperors, the ideas would come to them and to their advisors, or learned scholars would advocate that. In the modern period, lay people also want to have a say. Ordinary citizens want to have a say in the determination of the common good. And so therefore we've introduced different kind of procedures of how to determine the common good. We do surveys, assessments, and those kinds of things. And that obviously is one of the kind of big challenges of how one determines the common good. Or is there something, so someone like Ghazali might have serious problems with some issues of the common good that might be contrary to the revelation, right? And he would say, he would veto that. So some of these issues of the common good, at least from the Muslim perspective, is very much tied to Islamic moral and ethical teachings, and straying from those ethical and moral teachings, let me correct myself, contradicting those ethical and moral teachings will be a problem. But where the revelation and the Sharia is silent, there would be obviously the indifference. You can then determine how to best adjudicate that. But the question about, and we've all experienced it today, is that the more we talk about this question about the common good, we determine the common good through ideas of what we call discursive reasoning. That's called rational discourses. There are varieties of rational discourses. There's discursive reason, philosophical forms, technical reason. On a day-to-day basis, different kinds of reason dominate us, from our instruments that we use, from the buildings we use, from the traditions that palpitate in our souls. Those traditions come from very different places and times where reason and rationality and discursive is very different. But we are mixtures of those things in one instance. And so, yes, we can easily talk about questions such as, what is the common good, but we also know that these ideas of the common good are filled with paradoxes, depends where you're coming from and which tradition you are part of. And therefore my last point would be that what we've seen in the pandemic is that we are not only governed by reason. The pandemic didn't teach us for the first time, but we're also governed by unreason. Unreason forms a very, very important part of our existence and our being. We might not be able to always articulate it. In other words, it's what we call affect, our experiences, our emotions. Those emotions that cannot fully be articulated in words or in writing, but they are deep within us. These are our hesitations, these are our complexities, our ways in which we think as individuals or groups. And that obviously creates the dynamo of disagreement in societies. And this question of unreason goes back, it has a long history. And obviously we all hope that we can engage in conversation to lower the amount of disagreement amongst ourselves, but we have to be aware that people who come from a particular race, religion, or ethnic background feel strongly about those issues, even though they might not be able to rationally explain why they are like that. It's just one of those things that you feel, and one of the biggest challenges. And so therefore, I would argue that, most of us are trying to, talk about the vaccine. We try to talk about the values and health, outcomes of the vaccine, of masking, and the whole variety of things. But we also, those of us who do mask when we are forced to, like me, because I'm vaccinated and Notre Dame policy allows me, to not wear the mask. But when we have visitors, we need to mask up because to protect you and protect us. So this is the visitor policy, and therefore we do so. But there could be strong disagreement about that. That might be more rational, but sometimes it could also be from positions of unreason that comes from. And so I think that we are constantly, when we talk about the common good, we need to be fully aware that there are different kinds of discursivities, different ways of reasoning. We can all call it rational, but that rational is not one size fits all. Different people come to rationality from different perspectives, from different life experiences. And that, and furthermore, we need to negotiate and talk about what these issues are about the common good. So what we might have thought was a common good 100 years ago might not be the common good today. And in the same way, people will disagree with us going forward. And lastly, Ghazali would say that a very important way of thinking about this, and they always thought in terms of analogies, he would say that, the body, when the body gets ill, the body is regulated in in his world, and the world of medicine at his time operated on very fundamental the four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Right? If those things are out of balance, you get sick. And so he says that you need to find remedies for that in medicine, in tib, the Arabic word for medicine. You must find yourself a good person. And he says when it comes to the question of the external life, your internal life, that is your body, the external life, the question of politics and justice, for that you must have fiqh. For that you must have thinking. You must have thinking for that. And thinking is precisely the word that Muslims use also for Islamic law. Okay? So thinking and discernment, this ability to discern is quite critical to the Ghazalian project. And therefore, it is through discernment. Now, I know the word discernment in Catholic social teachings has a different meaning, but discerning literally means to discern, to understand, to know in all its complexity. And I think that's what we need to work on, in my view, in order to come to more complex understandings of the common good. Thank you very much. Very happy to take your questions. But not until the chairperson says.
Yes, we'll have a period now of discussion among the panelists, but I just want to make a few observations about the trajectory of discussion here, because I'm really impressed by the way in which these different presentations fit together so well. We got, first of all, a very concentrated, a beautiful view of these intense personalities, Ibn Verga, Duns Scotus, Ghazali, existing in these wildly different times and places, but intensely grappling with the problems that we're grappling with in really intelligent ways. And we started off with this idea from Michael Friedland, which shows us the way in which living together in society, so this sort of shared life of Jews and Christians in the Middle Ages, gave the possibility for recognizing a shared humanity, which allows for some kind of perspective that we do have a common good and that we can in fact reflect together on the common good. And it's really the kind of separation of lives where we don't actually have overlapping lives and overlapping experiences. That's where the demonization and stereotyping and the impossibility of conversation begins to emerge. And then we saw from Daniel Horan the way in which we can, a kind of philosophical reflection on the meaning and value of the human person grows out of that kind of shared encounter. And it's really when we see the individual as a reflection of the divine and something that is deeply prized and desired by God, that we can begin to express that same thing in ourselves. And it occurred to me that there's a way in which the individuality and individualism and the common good, which are often sort of played off against each other, we see in the thought of Duns Scotus a way of bringing those two things back together again, where it's really the recognition of the value of the individual that makes us be committed to the common good. And then lastly, Ebrahim Moosa spelled out beautifully a program for the nucleus of the common good in these 5 things. And I think when we hear this list, we hear, religion, intellect, life, property, family, we realize that these are, in fact, pillars of the things that all human beings desire intensely, and that can bring us together around the common good. But then also, as Professor Moosa shows us, there's a huge difficulty in spelling out the details. We can come together on the structure, but how do we spell out the details, and how many challenges there are just because of the different backgrounds that we have of being able to concretize what exactly the human good or the common good looks like in the concrete instances that we then come to disagree about. So I'm going to open it up for the panelists to raise questions or have comments for each other. We'll do that for maybe about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Can I make it? Yeah. Maybe we can just have this back and forth. Well, thank you for that interlocking of the 3 presentations. So something that strikes me is I sit, it's interesting, we were alphabetical, but we're also historically chronological in terms of the religious traditions represented. I think that's really nice. But as I'm sitting here, between the 2 perspectives shared already, I was thinking about an overlap, some resonance that isn't immediately apparent. I very much appreciated this phrase unreason and the recognition that there are different types of knowing, right? Affectivity being one of them, emotion being one of them, things that are not easily articulated or intellectually expressed. So it's not always a bad thing, but I can't help but think about some of the tensions that exist in our own time, as you rightly pointed out, when thinking about this, the questions of the common good in response to challenges in our society, that unreason plays a particular role. And then I was thinking about what Ibn Verga, one of the interesting insights that I took away from your presentation was that he was somebody, whether intentionally or otherwise in his writing, kind of an exemplar of self-criticality, right? Inviting his own community, himself included, to say, this isn't self-flagellation, this isn't this sort of thing, but it's like, can we examine ourselves? Can we see where maybe we have fallen short? And I wonder if part of the unreason we might see today arises from a lack of willingness in our respective communities, our families, ourselves, to engage in that self-criticality. It's other-centered in the worst way, not the Scotist way in terms of divine love, but other-centered is in kind of an antagonistic way. And that just got me thinking about the Franciscan tradition of which Scotus is a part, and the primacy of relationship that flows from Francis and Clare of Assisi all the way through the tradition that led them to embrace evangelical poverty, that led them to go into the world rather than to monasteries, famously, as Francis would articulate. And I'm just wondering, I'm thinking a lot about, in light of these 2 presentations, about the role of self-criticality and unreason and how those may form barriers to relationship in the common good.
And I was thinking of something similar along the line of self-criticality of the importance of modesty, because as you pointed out, Therese, that one area of tension and listening to both of you, it kind of came up. On the one hand, Scotus talking about the importance of the individual, and then listening to Dr. Moosa talk about Sharia law, which is similar with it's the same tension in Judaism with halakha, with Jewish law, where you have, hey, everybody can think their own thing and we can argue about it, but you know what, eventually you got to do the same thing. You got to work together. And there's this tension between individual, and especially in our liberal culture that we live in today, there is this tension between the role of the individual and this notion of the common good. And so you called it criticality, self-criticality. I'm thinking of the importance of how desperate we need modesty, that value of modesty, where we can say that, and it's a necessity when we talk about the common good, where we have to be able to say at some point, I don't want to give up my own personal dignity, but to be part of a community, I do have to be willing to step back a little bit. And that's a real tough tension, because where do you step back? What do you give up of yourself? What areas am I willing to share to say, I'm not, because of the community, I have to accept this. And what areas I say, I can't do that. And that's a really tough question in the world that we live in today. I don't have a solution for it, but it's...
Yeah, I would agree, and thanks for the question. So Ghazali also adopts a life of poverty. This when he goes on this travel, he is very little. I mean, people write about him. They say, this was this guy who walked into Baghdad on so much expensive clothes, and now his clothing is worth nothing. He's completely transformed person. So this question of modesty and this question of having to live with little, to keep the eye on the remedying of the soul and to keep greed and other kinds of impulses under control is basically part of the project. Obviously, it becomes very difficult in a liberal and consumerist society how to keep our desires under control. The whole operation is about desire, right? It is all about the manufacturing and construction of desire, and desire is desire. And the other point is about the question of the common, the greater good and the common good and the individual. And the issue that it's a tough one, even in Islam. Now, liberal Islam is trying to battle with that issue, and but when there is a greater good at stake and the individual, then the individual, at least someone like Ghazali would say, the individual must forgo their individual options and rather go with the common good. Although he himself sometimes would go against the grain of other theologians who would call him out and say, "You stepped out of line here." Mm-hmm. So he's wavering between those positions which he feels strongly and dissents. This idea to dissent from the dominant opinion, or now dissenting intellectually is one thing, acting differently against the grain could be another problematic. You might like this, Rabbi, is that one of the things that Ghazali wants people to do is to be competent, and so when he gets frustrated and people are not competent, then he says, "Be a Jew proper. Well, otherwise don't mess with the Torah," because he understands that the Torah is a complex interpretation, and then you say, "Kun Yahudiyan sirfan wa illa fala tal'ab bit-Torah." Be a proper Jew, otherwise don't mess with the Torah. He wants you to be competent and know that. So I thought it was a great interfaith joke.
Yeah, so if you have questions that you've written out on your cards, you can go ahead and pass them up, and then we'll read out as many questions as we can here at the microphone for Therese. So this question reads, the medieval era ended in Inquisition and the modern era began with genocide. Today we are confronted with climate catastrophe and extinction. So what good are all these teachings on the common good? It's a tough one.
I don't think as a community we listened well then, and we're not listening well now, so maybe we can attune our attention to listen and reflect better now is the only thing I can say, but it's a fair context that was presented.
Didn't Wittgenstein say that which you do not know of, you should keep silent? Right? I don't know some of these answers. I mean, but it is problematic. In a recent article on the question of divine human responsibility, divine action and human responsibility, a volume of essays, I started talking about the different Muslim conceptions of human conduct and responsibility, and halfway in the essay I gave up. I said all those formulations don't really work. Let's just go back to the human condition, and I started off with the question of the climate crisis and said, here we are in the Anthropocene. How do we conduct ourselves? How do we move out of here? And then I thought that looking at real life experiences, the way novelists and poets articulate that gave me greater hope that I could navigate that rather than tradition talking about, free will and predestination and that ongoing stuff, whereas we know that the human condition is complex. And it's that complexity that we need to navigate this. So, yes, what good is this? I think that it's a lot of good. I think that this human experience, if we don't go forward by keeping our past experience in the rear view mirror, we might repeat what the questioner just said. And so I think the importance of keeping history, complex understandings of history. Unfortunately, history is sometimes presented in self-serving ways, that we read the past in order to make the present possible, and we don't raise the question or the uncomfortable questions of history because there's so much invested in the kinds of decisions we have already taken, and these changes that if we are going to take history seriously will mean that we'll have to make some adjustments. I mean, most people will tell you that we cannot continue and make any dent in climate in the climate crisis unless we change our modes of living, our modes of consumption. That is a given. But we have not taken any steps in that. We are obviously taking some very superficial steps and so on. We think that going electric is going to solve the problem, but there are other challenges that is beyond my pay grade. But I know when serious experts tell me that I need to be attentive. So I think that we need to take history seriously, and also possibly we'll have to make decisions based on what common sense tells us and how we need to navigate the common good. So common sense is clearly part of that in decision making of the common good, at least on the Islamic tradition, because the historical tradition, the revelation gives you a teaching on a very particular situation, and then 50 years later that particular situation no longer works. So what you need to invoke? You need to invoke a common sense, and that's what the second Caliph Omar, who actually started this idea of what is maslahah, what is the greater good, and advocated changes to some of the interpretation that the Prophet just made in a particular way, and he did something different. So I think that the common sense is part of the common good.
Yeah, I don't know. The only thing I'd say is, quoting Rabbi Nachman, who's one of the Hasidic masters, the whole world is a very narrow bridge. The main thing is not to be afraid, not to despair, that there's hope. I guess I wonder if one of the advances, or one of the things that are different today regarding two of the tragedies you mentioned, I don't know if during the period of the Inquisition, I mean, obviously the victims felt that the Inquisition was terrible. I don't know if the people employing the Inquisition thought it was such a terrible thing. Now it's kind of understood that it wasn't appropriate. Obviously the Holocaust, now I think it's universally understood that this is something that we never again. Now, of course, it happens constantly, genocide in the world we live in, but it's recognized as something which is unacceptable. And I guess that's the only hope, is that as these kind of factors, as human beings, those human beings who can follow the SCOTUS model of recognizing the humanity of each person and God's love of each individual. Obviously, each of the other traditions have such similar thinkers, that as that grows, and if we can grow that, then there's this sense that it's of coming together, that all these tragedies are not acceptable. The danger is that we figure it out after the fact. So that's the challenge, I think, is how do we get enough people to recognize before, while the tragedy is we're in the middle of tragedy, to how do we stop it? And again, I bring up this notion of this sense of modesty, it is sorely lacking in the world that we live in today. And when I say modesty, I mean a sense that there's something more important than me, that I'm not the only one that matters. That is a really hard concept in a consumerist society, which is tragic and is a problem, which is maybe the biggest, the underlying problem in our society today. But I think that's it, is that to have a sense, to grow a sense in our cultures and in our communities, that there's something more important than me, something greater than myself, and then perhaps there will be, we'll be able to stop this in the midst of the tragedy.
If I can just add something else to that, it came to me listening to my colleagues here on the panel, which is that I think SCOTUS does offer, my initial response was a bit flip about not listening, but part of that is which traditions, which interpretations, which is a whole conversation, whether in the Islamic tradition, whether it's the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, some voices get subjugated, some get elevated, some get canonized literally and figuratively. And one thing that comes to mind is SCOTUS's principle of individuation is not just about human beings. I talked about it within the context of this panel, assuming we were talking about the contemporary understanding of the common good, which really is about the polis and human society and how we relate to one another. But SCOTUS literally says everything that's created has the question is the philosophical question of universals and singulars. How do we distinguish an individual thing from any other given thing of a common genus, let's say, or something like that? And so, he uses the example of stones and blades of grass and non-human creatures. The example I use sometimes when teaching students is to talk about, that old reference to every snowflake is individual. I mean, SCOTUS would say, yeah, and every grain of sand and so forth. The reason I bring that up is because the common good, though this wasn't the focus of my prepared remarks today, the common good needs to be expanded, I believe, in the time that we find ourselves in, as you rightly said, the Anthropocene that we're in this moment, is to recognize that the common good includes all of creation and not just human creatures. And so until we realize that, and I think that's the challenge before us, our deep interdependence, that the principle of individuation is not about individualism. I think sometimes that gets heard incorrectly by folks. I just want to reiterate that. But rather it's how do we understand the dignity and value, God's intention when God creates anything that exists, and that anything exists at all. That notion of contingency speaks volumes about the value, including of non-human creatures, which, frankly, what good is it for us to talk about the human polis, to talk about the common good or the general good or the way we structure our societies if there is no oxygen for us to breathe, or there are there's no water for us to drink? A lot of this will be kind of in the vein of the questioners. I think I'm interpreting it as a kind of earned cynicism in the spirit of modesty and humility. It's true. I would say, well, what good is it? It's not going to be very good at all. So I would just suggest that we expand our notion in that spirit of modesty or intellectual humility, that it's not all about us, and certainly that arises spiritually from within the Franciscan tradition alongside others. I can't help but think of the protagonist of your presentation being called out for saying, well, actually, no, God does recognize the singulars and not just the universals, and that's a Scotistic solidarity move against some Aristotelian interpretations of the Middle Ages, so thank you for that.
So we are out of time, and let me thank our panelists. And thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
And let me thank, by the way, Andy Gillian, our public humanities fellow at the Mirza Institute, for organizing this. It was her vision, her idea. She did all of the hard work. I just get to kind of take a little bit of credit for it, but not deservedly.
Thank you.